Well, here we are in Seattle, your home place where you're from, coming back for the Refed 2025 event, which I'm so glad they had it here. And you had a session on changing the narrative. Sophie Egan, by the way, with Food for Climate League. What was that session all about?
Yeah, it's really about the fact that words matter, right?
Yeah.
One of the most interesting things that happened in the session was someone stated the elephant in the room, which is the W word, waste. The word waste, food waste, is a social construct in itself. Yeah. And there was this really interesting kind of call in the room for a better word, a better set of nomenclature. So we talked about, examples like on the sustainable seafood side, there used to be this thing called trash fish, right? The kind of fish that nobody wanted, and it became underloved seafood. Or think about something like, repurposing and upcycling, right? People started to talk about just calling things like trim or just surplus, and how the words instantly give you a different mental model and just change the whole conversation, but that collectively we have an opportunity, first and foremost, just to get that W word out of the way.
It's so interesting because we had so much of that conversation in the alt protein space, like what do we call like cultivated meat? It used to be clean meat. Then that was like, okay, that's weird. And then it was like, no one likes the idea of lab grown meat.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to have that reframing conversation in food waste, but you're so right. Waste is like not necessarily a great word, but it is what we're talking about. So,
yeah.
So did you guys come up with any solutions?
A couple people tossed out, some people shared from their own examples. There was a company where they started calling it Sparks, like scraps spelled backwards, but with a C. I think it was a gentleman from Denali and formerly Boulder, but there wasn't a consensus yet, but it was more of a call to action to say, we can figure this out. And a lot of it had to do with the power of social norms, which from Food for Climate League, what we often talk about with narrative and behavior change is how much social norms matter. So if waste is the thing that we're all talking about, it sort of sets this expectation that it's acceptable, right? As opposed to something that you don't do. And also, talking about the alt protein space, we were talking about how in the chef community, right, there's distinct norms among chefs too. So on the protein side, or on the plant forward side, even the word protein has often been used to be synonymous with meat. And there's been a similar call to say, how do we just untrain that language, at least in the kind of micro community of chefs, and we can also do the same thing for back of house food waste reduction by just starting to use those terms like trim or scraps or tomorrow's food, right? Or ingredients, right? So it's probably going to be a different taxonomy depending on who's using it, right? It might not be that we find the one perfect word. Hopefully we can.
Yeah.
But we also talked a lot about the things that we at Food for Climate League often describe like an intention action gap, right? That even the word waste signals a sense of shame and guilt, right? And no one wants to feel that.
That doesn't motivate people.
It doesn't motivate
you have to
people.
positively motivate
Right.
them. So I almost want to make a recommendation. Like, and we talked about the idea of food efficiency. Like, is that an idea?
That came up, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and especially thinking about that kind of optimization or utilization or resource, in the technical sense, I don't think anybody wants to start saying whole animal utilization or whole product utilization.
You don't want to sound like consultants all the time.
Right,
That
that's a little
has no
jargony.
soul to it. It doesn't resonate with people. But it was interesting. I before you interviewed Andrew Shackman with LeanPath, he's great, and he's talking about how, early on in the food waste fight, it was all about like saving dollars and cents and making things more efficient. About 10 years ago, it became about sustainability. But in the current moment, as things like kind of sustainability in the current political environment, it's getting pushed down the totem pole of importance a little bit. Kind of this efficiency is making a comeback in a sense, because everyone loves to save money. No one likes to waste money, and like when you reduce waste, you save money. So I wonder if that's kind of like how we should frame it nowadays.
I mean, I think for sure. The other thing we talked a lot about was just, leading with the things that people care the most about. So certainly the business case is something that most audiences care about. One of the biggest themes of the session was really about tailoring your message, right? It might not be a one size fits all, but there are these things that pretty much matter to everybody. And cost is one of them, right? And the consumer insights data has always been so consistent that, when on the consumer side, taste, cost, convenience, a little bit below that, health, and sustainability is much lower. So it's an interesting point that like maybe there's sort of a resurgence to some of this more higher on the hierarchy type of factors. But what we also were really intrigued by was someone asked about, what about people who are really motivated by zero waste? Like it's part of their identity. It's this tribe they want to be part of. Are you saying we don't lead with that for them? And one of the panelists, was sharing, Abby Falmartino from CIA. She said, well, leading with flavor or leading with cost, like these things are going to appeal to everyone. So as opposed to sort of leading with zero waste in the case that like that one niche slice of the population really responds to it, lead with the things that most likely will cover everyone, including the zero waste community, right?
What about generational differences when you're talking about these messages and how you're framing things and creating narratives, particularly the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, or whatever the generation below that is, I can never remember, but how do we, I think they're oftentimes motivated about important causes. They want to make the world better. Is food waste one of them? And if so, how do we kind of talk about it with them?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because at Food for Climate League, we have these kind of best practices for how to talk about food and climate. And one of the main takeaways is no matter who you're talking to, often just don't talk about climate, period. And that's been really interesting because people think that younger generations actually want to hear more about climate, want to hear more about sustainability. But this is actually fairly consistent in cross-generational groups, that even if there's variations maybe in like how high on that hierarchy it is, most often it's not their number one. So the point there being that there are some of these similarities where most often it's going to be about shaping a narrative and using a frame that is actually more kind of cross-generational, cross-demographic, and cross-psychographic. The other thing we talked a lot about is that not talking about waste and leading with other stories, other narratives, it can also just help kind of show people who may not see themselves as having a role. So we talked a lot about like who does have a role, right? And it was really interesting. One of the panelists, Brian Lipinski from World Resources Institute, was sharing that his husband and his dad are the two biggest food waste warriors he knows, and like none of them have ever heard of SDG 12.3, right? And they don't even talk about waste. They don't identify as that. So I think when it comes to generational differences, just in thinking about those anecdotal examples, you might think about just people who are creative. Maybe there's a more expanded vocabulary is what I would say to think about how people might identify, right? We heard this from one of the chefs earlier today too, that some of it might just be about getting a little bit funky in the kitchen, like having some fun, right? It might not be that they're sitting there saying, I'm a food waste warrior. But the main thing I would say that's different by generation is the mediums. So we talked a lot about like the rise of podcasts, social media, TikTok, right? And the message might be different, but for sure it's how they're getting information might also really depend. So you most likely will need to just match more of the channel, and the trusted messengers really vary by generational group.
I mean, us within the industry here at ReFed, it's great to have a specificity to the language to kind of more accurately describe what's happening, kind of that inside baseball conversation. But there's a power to more plain spoken communication to people in the broader community, in the broader world, and kind of saying, hey, we don't have all these terms. If I'm just a food waste warrior, just wasting less food, being less, it just seems like there's a power in more plain spokenness.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it was really interesting because another panelist, Andrew Kaplan, or Cappy, from Rachel Ray Foundation, he was saying that on the Rachel Ray show, they had this really interesting kind of litmus test for all the content that Rachel would ever show on, showing for 17 years, something like that. And it would be just how accessible was the language? Was there anything mentioned in the episode where someone would kind of scratch their head or, scratch their face and say like, what are you talking about, right? So the plain spokenness it's kind of what I was saying about leading with flavor, like what are those universal messages, right? And one of the things that I didn't mention in the panel, but that I've often, I think, found to be really helpful is that in addition to, again, those kind of differences, there are these core human needs and kind of universal themes. So there's a really interesting study, I think it was last year, where they looked at messages across different countries to see what most motivates action on climate. And what they found is that love for the next generation was far and away the most resonant frame. And it didn't matter the generation, didn't matter the country. And it's just, it's things like that speak to these core human needs of control, community, the connection, the biological connection, that intergenerational connection that sort of span all of these other differences that we may have. So it's both kind of like finding what are those more universally resonant messages, and in addition to going deeper to kind of tailor and double click with your target audience.
In food, in kind of talking to CPGs, talking with food inputs providers, there's no doubt that the moment we're in with MAHA and everything is changing a lot of the conversations and kind of forcing a lot of folks to kind of reevaluate how they're making things, what their recipe lists, etc. What are some of the conversations you're having now in this moment?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're hearing people talk about that you could take away and maybe share with us?
Yeah, well, I think that it's very interesting, right? Because I actually would tie it back again to that intergenerational point, or the love for the next generation. I think it's very fascinating to me to just watch the way that in previous administration, right, feeding kids real healthy food was seen as like a leftist thing, and now it's literally swung the other way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually great news, because that really illustrates these core bonds that we have among as humans. Like, who wants their kid to be sick? Like, nobody wants that, right? If you're a parent, a grandparent, a caregiver, whoever it is. And it actually, I think, in a way, is really unifying to see that there are some of these things that had been almost like weaponized to have the identity with certain causes. Like, maybe you had to pretend you didn't want dye in your food if you were a Republican, or previously, right? Or now it's almost like kind of like taking this layer, taking like shining a light on it and coming out of the open. The reality that we're more alike than different. But in the past, I think there had been more need to sort of like differentiate, if that makes sense. So that's one example with the whole minimally processed foods example, or just that whole thread of conversation. And I think that there's actually a ton of consensus about the fact that, like, youth matter and the next generation and children, and the same way that it was mentioned earlier in today's event that food waste reduction is one of the truly bipartisan topics.
It truly is.
It's
like,
again in that,
no one
like,
likes waste.
It's in your bones, right? You don't need to be educated about it to know that, like, this just seems wrong, right? Or wrong, like it rubs you the wrong way, and it might rub you the wrong way for different reasons.
And hopefully, even though it maybe took a certain politician to say this is now okay for you to like, maybe, unfortunately, that's the way it is. Maybe everyone will start to appreciate better, healthier, natural food now. So that's a good thing.
Exactly.
So we're here in Seattle, 2025 Refed. What are you most excited about? What you're hearing about today? Anything in particular?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I'm most excited about is the sense of now is the time. And I've worked in food systems change for a long time, and sometimes it can feel like, gosh, are we going to be working on this for like the next 300 years?
Right.
Like when will we know we've succeeded, right? When it's change or transformation, it can feel like you are just on a never-ending quest to like an impossible destination. And it feels like there are tangible examples that show, not across the board, like the train has reached the station, but there's these like micro examples that collectively show like the real dent that's being made. At the same time that we're not kidding ourselves, we're not there. Collectively, we're not there. And what I mean by that is, Dana Gunders was describing the scale of the scale has grown. And that's something to celebrate. And it's something that really fires me up about being here. But we can't rest on the laurels to say, just because there are these kind of examples in more micro, or like certain sectors or certain regions. So I think I'm excited about almost us like leveling up the expectations of how big this can get, even as we take stock of the progress that's been made.
All right, well, Sophie Egan, Food for Climate League, author. I feel like I can name about 10 other things you do, because you do so much. Thank you for spending time with me today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
This was great.